For centuries, ancient maps revealed far more than continents and trade routes. Along forgotten margins of old cartography, strange lines appeared across the oceans, interrupted coastlines, uncertain barriers, and regions marked as though there were limits few sailors were willing to cross. Among those areas, one of the most intriguing emerged near what many historical maps called Tartary, an immense territory that slowly vanished from modern historical language. But why did certain seas near this region seem to be treated almost like forbidden frontiers? And why did early navigators repeatedly describe surrounding waters as difficult, unstable, and avoided whenever possible? When old maritime records, forgotten routes, and incomplete charts are examined together, one question begins to emerge with unusual force. Was there an ocean surrounding Tartary that ancient sailors deliberately refused to cross? During the great age of maritime expansion, the ocean became the stage where empires measured power. Every new route meant access to wealth, territory, and influence. Nations pushed farther into unknown waters because every coastline discovered could alter the balance of global trade. Yet even in an era defined by relentless exploration, some regions remained strangely absent from regular navigation patterns. Instead of well-established routes, there were detours. Instead of detailed records, there were gaps. Instead of frequent crossings, there was hesitation. To the north of Asia, especially across the frozen waters extending toward the far eastern limits of the continent, many old maps displayed enormous maritime spaces bordering the territory long identified as Tartary. Official history explains Tartary as a broad European cartographic label used to describe vast parts of northern and central Asia before political borders became more precisely understood. It was not, according to conventional scholarship, a single unified empire, but a general name covering lands inhabited by many peoples and governed by changing powers. Yet the persistence of that name across centuries continues to provoke modern curiosity, because while land borders changed, the surrounding waters often remained uncertain for much longer than expected. Ancient navigators repeatedly described northern maritime routes as unstable, dangerous, and difficult to trust. Ice drifted unpredictably. Winds changed without warning. Visibility collapsed under dense fog. Entire passages could appear navigable one season and become impossible the next. Today, modern climate science explains this clearly. Arctic navigation has always been shaped by extreme natural conditions. But in older centuries, these same conditions gave certain seas an almost mythic reputation. This is where the idea of a forbidden ocean begins. Not because there was an official law preventing entry, but because some waters functioned as a practical barrier powerful enough to discourage repeated attempts. In regions bordering Tartary, ancient maritime movement remained inconsistent for generations. Ships turned back. Expeditions failed. Routes were abandoned or delayed for decades. Even when European powers aggressively pursued new passages, northern crossings near these territories remained among the hardest to establish. The so-called Northeast Passage, which follows the northern edge of Asia, is one of the clearest examples. For centuries, explorers tried to open this route because it promised faster access between Europe and Asia. But ice, violent storms, shifting currents, and narrow seasonal windows repeatedly blocked progress. Entire expeditions became trapped or forced into retreat. Official history treats this as a story of natural resistance, one of geography defeating ambition. But alternative interpretations give those same waters a deeper symbolic role. If Tartary represented more than a geographic label, some argue, then the ocean around it may have served as a natural shield, limiting outside access to regions that remained isolated longer than surrounding territories. In that reading, the sea was not simply difficult. It was one of the reasons certain inland areas developed under relative separation for longer periods, before eventually being absorbed into modern state systems. That theory gains emotional strength when old maps are placed side by side. In many 16th, 17th, and 18th century charts, coastlines near northern Asia appear strangely inconsistent. Some sections are highly detailed, while others dissolve into uncertainty. Islands appear and disappear across editions. Certain maritime zones are marked with unusual caution. For historians, this reflects ordinary cartographic limitations. Some areas had better survey information than others. But for those who search for hidden patterns, each inconsistency feels meaningful. Because where knowledge suddenly stops, imagination begins. Ancient mapmakers often filled unknown waters with symbols, sea creatures, warnings, uncertain boundaries, and decorative elements that suggested danger or incomplete understanding. Modern scholars recognize this as visual language common to the period, not literal evidence of mystery. Yet the psychological effect remains powerful. A blank sea rarely attracts attention. A sea marked as uncertain becomes memorable. And when uncertainty appears repeatedly near a territory like Tartary, the narrative naturally grows larger. The fascination deepens because Tartary itself slowly disappeared from maps while surrounding geopolitical language became more precise. Over time, the immense label broke apart into regions controlled by expanding imperial administrations, especially under Russia and neighboring powers. New names replaced older ones, borders sharpened, administrative categories expanded. But the old maps survived, and with them survived a visual memory of a territory so vast that many now wonder whether official historical simplifications fully explain why it appeared so prominently for so long. The ocean surrounding that world becomes important because maritime access often determines how quickly outside narratives dominate inland history. If the surrounding waters were harsh enough to slow regular entry, then inland regions would naturally remain more mysterious to outside observers for longer periods. Some maritime accounts from northern waters mention unexpected ice far outside predicted zones, persistent fog banks that lasted for days, and currents strong enough to force sudden route changes. In modern terms, these are normal polar phenomena. But for early sailors without modern forecasting, they could feel almost intentional, as though the sea itself rejected passage. The deeper researchers look into old maritime charts. The more often they encounter an unusual pattern. The northern edges of the known world were rarely drawn with full confidence. While the Atlantic gradually became filled with established routes and repeated crossings, the waters above Asia often remained marked by hesitation. Cartographers added coastlines, erased islands, changed proportions, and sometimes left entire stretches unfinished, as if every new expedition returned with information that only partially confirmed what earlier maps had suggested. Near the outer limits of Tartary, this uncertainty became especially visible. In several early European maps, northern maritime borders appear almost defensive in their visual language. Large blank spaces separate coastlines from one another. Narrow openings suggest routes that were technically possible but practically unreliable. Some waters are bordered by notes that imply seasonal danger, while others seem intentionally vague, as though mapmakers preferred to admit uncertainty rather than pretend certainty where none existed. This matters because maps were not only scientific tools, they were also political instruments. Every line placed on paper represented knowledge, and knowledge meant control. If a coastline could be drawn, it could eventually be claimed, taxed, defended, and integrated into imperial systems. But where lines remained uncertain, authority remained incomplete. That is one reason why northern maritime regions gained such symbolic importance. Whoever understood those waters could potentially control hidden access to enormous inland territories. Yet for centuries, even major naval powers struggled to establish reliable passage there. The northern route above Asia was repeatedly attempted because it promised something extraordinary: a shorter connection between Europe and the markets of the East, without depending on southern passages controlled by competing empires. But what looked simple on paper became brutal in reality. Ice formations shifted unexpectedly. Narrow passages froze shut. Wooden ships became trapped for months. Crews suffered from cold, hunger, and isolation. In many expeditions, survival became more important than discovery. This repeated pattern created an atmosphere around those waters that extended far beyond navigation. Sailors began carrying stories from failed crossings. Reports described regions where compasses behaved strangely, where fog erased horizons for days, and where coastlines visible one week became unreachable the next because of drifting ice barriers. Modern science explains these conditions clearly. Magnetic variation, polar weather instability, and sea ice movement are well documented today. But in earlier centuries, these experiences often sounded almost supernatural. And once maritime fear enters collective memory, routes become psychologically closed even when physically possible. That helps explain why some stretches of Northern Ocean remained underused for so long despite enormous strategic interest. Meanwhile, inland Tartary remained visually immense on maps. The combination was powerful, a giant territory inland, bordered by seas that resisted easy access. To many later observers, this looked less like coincidence and more like a forgotten geographic shield. Alternative historians often point to this contrast. They argue that while official history describes Tartary as merely a broad label for lands Europeans did not fully categorize, the repeated difficulty of reaching its northern margins may have contributed to why the region remained conceptually distant for so long. In their interpretation, the ocean was not just an environmental obstacle, it was part of why the territory preserved an aura of mystery. Some even suggest that ancient navigators may have known certain areas were not worth repeated attempts, because conditions made reliable return uncertain. A route that cannot guarantee return becomes economically useless, no matter how promising it looks on a map. That practical reality shaped exploration more than ambition alone. In archived maritime records, several northern expeditions ended not because ships were destroyed, but because captains chose retreat after encountering patterns they could not predict. Ice closed passages unexpectedly. Winds pushed vessels toward shallow, unknown coastlines. Navigation instruments lost reliability under heavy magnetic disturbance. To modern readers, these are expected polar hazards, but to sailors who depended entirely on visible stars, manual charts, and fragile instruments, the ocean could suddenly feel alive in a hostile way. This may explain why some old maps began representing northern waters with caution that almost resembles warning. Certain 18th century charts show maritime zones above Asia with far less confidence than coastal regions already explored elsewhere. While southern trade routes became increasingly precise, these northern edges still carried ambiguity, as if each expedition added information, but never enough to remove doubt entirely. And doubt on a map becomes a kind of boundary. That boundary is one reason theories surrounding Tartary continue to attract attention today, because the name itself already suggests something vast and forgotten. And when combined with seas that historically resisted easy crossing, the image becomes almost cinematic. An enormous inland world protected not by walls of stone, but by climate, distance, and unstable water. There is also another detail that reinforces this fascination. Some early explorers believed northern coastlines would eventually open into clear passages farther east, only to discover repeated interruptions. Peninsulas extended farther than expected. Ice-locked channels that maps had imagined open. Shorelines turned into dead ends. Each failed expectation added another layer of caution to future attempts. By the time more reliable polar knowledge emerged, centuries of uncertainty had already shaped how these waters were remembered. And memory matters because history is not only built from facts, but also from the emotions attached to difficult places. The ocean surrounding northern Tartary became one of those places where geography created narrative, a place where every incomplete map looked meaningful, a place where every blank section invited speculation, a place where natural difficulty was easily interpreted as intentional concealment. Today, satellite imagery leaves little mystery about these regions, but the emotional power of old maps remains strong because ancient cartography captured not just coastlines, but human uncertainty itself. And few things create stronger mystery than uncertainty preserved on paper for centuries, especially when that uncertainty surrounds a territory whose very name seems to belong to another historical layer. That is why the ocean around Tartary continues to be discussed not only as geography, but as atmosphere, a cold maritime edge where known routes weakened, where confidence faded, and where many believed something larger remained beyond easy reach. As centuries passed, the waters surrounding Tartary continued to preserve the same reputation: unpredictable, hostile, and strangely resistant to certainty. Expeditions returned with fragments of information, but never enough to erase the atmosphere of doubt that old maps had already created. One voyage suggested open passages, another found only ice. One captain described reachable coastlines, while the next reported barriers that seemed impossible to cross. The ocean did not offer consistency, and because of that, every new attempt seemed to reopen the same unanswered questions. That uncertainty became part of Tartary's image itself. A vast territory shown on historical maps, bordered by seas that often behaved like moving walls, helped create the idea of a world separated not only by distance, but by conditions that repeatedly discouraged full access. While official history explains Tartary as a broad geographic label used for lands that Europe had not yet politically defined in detail, the visual power of those maps still leaves room for fascination. When a territory appears enormous, distant, and surrounded by difficult waters, mystery naturally survives. The Northern Ocean played a powerful role in that survival. Unlike southern trade routes that became predictable through repetition, these waters resisted routine. Ice shifted without warning, fog erased direction, and short navigation windows made every crossing uncertain. For early sailors, this was enough to transform geography into something larger than a route. It became a frontier that seemed to push people back again and again. And perhaps that is why the idea of a forbidden ocean remains so compelling today. Not because history confirms hidden barriers, but because the combination of old maps, unfinished coastlines, and unstable maritime records creates a narrative that still feels unfinished. The sea around Tartary became more than water. It became part of the legend. Even now, when modern technology has mapped every visible coastline, the old charts continue to provoke questions. Why did so many early maps leave these regions uncertain for so long? Why did routes remain incomplete despite centuries of exploration? And why does the name Tartary still capture so much attention whenever those forgotten maps reappear? Maybe the answer lies in the fact that some mysteries survive not because they are proven, but because they continue to invite interpretation. If you found this theory intriguing, leave your opinion in the comments. Do you think the ocean around Tartary was simply a natural obstacle, or do old maps suggest something that history has not fully explained? And if you enjoy hidden history, ancient maps, and forgotten theories, subscribe to the channel and like the video so we can continue uncovering mysteries that still challenge what we think we know.